Hello everyone. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about the osteology of the dog, the bones of the dog. So to begin with, we will start up here with the skull, and a couple things to note very quickly. If you were to remove the lower mandible here, this whole section then would be referred to as the cranium, but when the mandible is attached and the skeleton and the skull is complete, then this is referred to as the skull. If you notice, we have a nice strong zygomatic arch coming through here. The eyes are forward facing. There's long nasal bone extending out. We have the aggressive canine teeth that are representative of a carnivore. And if you'll notice, the molars that run through here also are very aggressive, very sharp. They're made for chewing and tearing meat. So this comprises the head and the skull of the dog. And you'll notice here on the spinal column, the vertebral column, it comes and it connects into the back, into the occipital region of the skull. So we have seven, just like with all mammals, the dog has 7 cervical vertebrae. The first vertebrae here is referred to as the atlas. The second vertebrae is the axis, and then it is followed by the other 5 cervical vertebrae. So on an interesting note, all mammals have 7 cervical vertebrae, except the 2-toed sloth, which has between 5 and 7, the 3-toed sloth that usually has 8 or 9, and then the manatee, which usually has between 5 and 7. So those are the 3 exceptions that don't have 7 cervical vertebrae. All other mammals, whether it's a giraffe or a mouse, they all have 7 cervical vertebrae. After the cervical vertebrae, the next section here we have are the thoracic vertebrae. In the case of the dog, they have 13 sets of ribs. So in their thoracic cage, there are 13 sets, and the thoracic vertebrae, typically whatever number of sets of ribs you would have the same number of thoracic vertebrae. So in this case, there would be 13 thoracic vertebrae, 13 sets of ribs. Just like with humans, and also with the cat and the capuchin monkey, which we've done already, there's 2 sets of floating ribs that are here in the back. Then down below here we have the sternum. The top section of the sternum is the manubrium. The very bottom section that hangs down and comes down a little bit below is the xiphoid process. Then we get to, this is the forelimb. This would be the hind limb. The forelimb begins up here with the scapula. If you notice, the scapula sits on the side of the thoracic cage and is meant to sustain the weight of the upper limb. In humans, the scapula would be on the back portion of the thoracic cage. This would be, on humans, it's the forelimb of the dog, but on humans this would be the upper arm. And just like with humans, this is the humerus. Then this next section would be our lower arm, and it's the lower part of the forelimb of the dog. This is the radius. Right next to it here is the ulna. The bone that sticks up here in the back is the back section of the ulna, and this is referred to as the olecranon, which would be the equivalent of our elbow. Down in here would be the head of the ulna. Then down beneath that we have the carpals, the metacarpals, and the phalanges. The phalanges, the bone that's closest to the hand is the proximal. The one in the middle is the medial phalange, and at the very end here we have the distal. The dog, in fact, the front paw of a dog is very similar to the human hand. So right in here, this would be the equivalent of the human thumb, which in the dog is referred to as the dew claw. So as we come on back here now, moving a little further back, this section of the vertebral column is the lumbar vertebrae. Then we get down here to the sacrum, which is down in between the pelvis. After the sacrum, we have the caudal bones, which would be the tail of the dog. If this were a human, it would end between 3 and 5 bones in here, and it would be referred to as the coccyx. But these are the caudal bones of the dog. Same with the monkey, same with the cat. They all extend on out. Then we have the pelvis. The pelvis is relatively flat. It does not have the bowl shape of the human. It's not quite as elongated as the cat, but it's again, it is relatively flat, and it supports the weight of the mass of the upper leg. So this is the upper leg. If this were the human, this would be our upper leg, and this would be the femur. We would have the ball and socket joint here connected to the pelvis. On the outside, the bony process here is known as the great trochanter. Then we get down here, and here is the patella. Just like humans, the dogs also have a patella. The large lower bone in the lower leg, right through here, is the tibia. This little bone here on the outside is the fibula. And then we get down into this area. These are the tarsal bones. The large bone that extends out in the back where the Achilles tendon would attach to if it were human is the calcaneus bone. Then we have, coming down to this lower section here, we have the metatarsals. After the metatarsals, we have the phalanges, just like up here in the paw, or what would be the hand. We have the phalanges down here. So we have the proximal, the medial, and the distal. Proximal, medial, distal on each one. An important thing to note is that the dog only has 4 digits, whereas the human has 5 digits. They do not have the equivalent of a big toe, or in the case of one of the apes or monkeys, they do not have the opposable big toe. So coming back in here, we'll notice the rib cage is very thin and narrow this way and has more girth this way. The dogs, they're all quadrupeds. They spend all their time walking on all fours. It's another thing that is notable is that they are digitigrade, so they walk on their toes and on their fingers. If they were plantigrade, they would be walking flat, but in this case, they're up on their toes, up on their fingers and toes, and so they are digitigrade. One thing that's unique about the dog that's very different from the human, the cat, and the monkey that we've covered before is, if you'll notice here, there are no collarbones. Dogs are incapable of side-to-side movement with their forelimbs. They can only move forward and backwards. So they have some limitation in their movement, which is unique to the dog. The horses can be similar that way as well. We'll get to that in another session later on. So that kind of sums up the basic anatomy of the dog. The structure is very dependent on the form and their form of movement, and everything, even though the anatomy is the same as the human, the structure varies to how they need to move in order for them to survive. So that concludes a little discussion about artistic anatomy with the dog.